Greetings, good evening. My name is Father Andrew Summerson, and on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event. For those of you that might not be familiar with Lumen Christi's mission, it was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago, and its mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition a living dialogue partner at the University of Chicago and in our broader society through courses, lectures, summer seminars for graduate students and undergraduate students, and also virtual events like these. If you like tonight's webinar, I want to alert you to some of Lumen Christi's other upcoming events. Together with the Kazana Society, the Institute will be presenting a webinar series entitled Catholics and Muslims, History, Theology, and Encounters. Our first event scheduled is a webinar event on Nicholas of Cusa there and the Quranic exegesis, Wednesday, July 21st at 6 p.m. Central. Today's event is the first of 4 summer webinar series co-presented with Our Lady of Dallas, Cistercian Abbey in Irving, Texas. In partnership with them, Lumen Christi aims to bring into focus the vibrant monastic intellectual tradition that God is working to build up in their monastery, which is visible in their apostolate, Cistercian preparatory school, as well as with some of the monks who teach at the University of Dallas. This summer's monastic wisdom webinar series puts this on full display to a wider audience through this online format. We would like to thank our co-sponsors for this webinar series, including the Harvard Catholic Forum, the Nova Forum, St. Benedict Institute, and Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture at the University of Dallas. If you would like to support our initiatives, you can support us in one of 3 or all of 3 ways. Join our mailing list, follow us on social media, and share word about these events with others. Word of mouth remains the most effective means of inviting others into the Catholic intellectual tradition. And at the end of this event, you'll be invited to participate in a survey that will help to gauge what Lumen Christi is doing right and what needs improving. Filling it out, you'll enter to win a gift card to Lumen Christi's favorite independent bookstore, the Seminary Co-op. Finally, you can support Lumen Christi financially by donating today to help continue put on events like these for free for viewers like you at lumenchristi.org/donate. During today's event, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. You can, however, post a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In addition to questions being read by the moderator, we will also give voice to our audience to ask some questions. Today's program is being recorded and will stream from our YouTube page and be posted to Lumen Christi's website. So it is easy for you to revisit the talk. A link will be included in your confirmation email, which will be shared tomorrow. So now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's distinguished speaker. Father Joseph Van House entered Our Lady of Dallas Abbey in 2003. He has served at Cistercian Preparatory School as a teacher, form master, and theology department head. He holds a licentiate in sacred theology and fundamental theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University and recently completed a doctorate in sacred theology at the Catholic University of America, writing on the commentary on the Song of Songs, tonight's subject, by Geoffrey of Auxerre. He currently serves on the theology faculty at the University of Dallas, and here then to speak to us today on the Song of Songs and monastic interpretation is Father Joseph Van House. I now invite him to unmute himself and to show his screen to begin his presentation. Father Joseph.
Thank you, Father Andrew. And thanks to everyone at the Lumen Christi Institute and everyone who's here with us tonight. I know that I speak for all the monks of Our Lady of Dallas in saying that we are delighted with the way that this series drives us to look more closely at the richness of our own tradition and to work to make it accessible to other people. We're also very honored by the chance to give these talks speaking personally, I've prepared my remarks tonight also by having looked at a number of the offerings that I wasn't aware of before on the Lumen Christi Institute's website and YouTube channel, and have been delighted by the way that my YouTube watch list has grown as I've been exposed to the great things that have already been done. Some years ago, I was first meeting with an older priest whom I wished to see for spiritual direction. In that first conversation, he had the boldness to ask me not just about my mission in life, my gifts, my prayer, but also about whether I had ever fallen in love. It's funny that it felt like a more personal question than the others, but it was not an idle question. Whether or not a person has experienced deep romantic human attachment is relevant for understanding the kinds of resources that a person has or might develop in building a life with and for the one who made all things and deserves all our love. The Song of Songs is an Old Testament book of romantic poetry. On the outward level, it reflects the unquenchable devotion between a man and a woman who delight in their times together and think constantly of each other in their times apart. Song of Songs has been treasured throughout Christian history, especially by monks and nuns, as a figurative representation of the ideal love to be shared between God and humanity. Tonight, in talking about this theme of the Song of Songs and monastic interpretation, I'm going to be following four main steps. I'm going to begin, first of all, by talking about some important features of the monastic way of reading the Old Testament in general, to give us a sense of context for how the Song of Songs is approached. Second, and this is because my knowledge especially focuses on the Latin West and on the Benedictine tradition, I'll focus on how the Song of Songs rises to prominence within that monastic tradition, which especially happens in the 12th century with the rise of the Cistercian order. Third, I'll present to you a modest sampling of 12th century citation from these works, especially as exploring the idea of the Song of Songs as a quest, as a journey for union with God. And then fourth and finally, we'll look at some more specific individual verses of the Song of Songs and how these monastic authors interpreted those in a particularly allegorical way and the accents and manners in which they approached that. Also, to address a simple terminological matter here at the beginning, I will speak primarily of monks tonight because the people who were doing the writing in the 12th century were mostly monks. But the importance of nuns as both audience and at times as writers for the development of this genre and tradition remains extremely important and an interesting theme, as I hope will become obvious. So to begin, Christian monks reading the Old Testament. Now, monasticism is an occasional phenomenon all over the world in many cultures, insofar as there are always some people who will want to withdraw themselves from society in order to study and meditate or pray, or however it's understood, and to avoid the sins and distractions of ordinary human commerce. For the Christian monk, however, there is a complicated tension. This instinct has a complexity to it because Christianity is not fundamentally a religion of withdrawal from the world. The classical Christian vision of reality is, to put it rather simply, this: the human race is broken spiritually, morally, and physically. And the creator of all things is approaching that human race in order to redeem and recreate it in Jesus, bringing about a salvaged and indeed perfect human community that can live forever in self-giving love and happiness. This means that for Christian monks, the monastery must above all be a place to pay attention to and follow the person of Jesus. They discover Jesus directly in prayer and indirectly in the persons of their fellow disciples by living, working, and praying alongside them. However, on the level of being able to know Jesus with the mind, and for example, discern the difference between Christian and non-Christian approaches in the fellow disciples around them, primary access to knowledge of Jesus Christ was obtained through the writings of those who knew him on earth, especially the Gospels and the epistles of the New Testament. These texts, of course, pointed to the entire rest of the Bible, and the monks devoted generations of energy to knowledge of this text. Every day they chanted its poetry, they proclaimed its narratives, they studied commentaries upon it, they reflected on its consistency, its inner workings, and its meaning for their lives. Your average monk had a far better understanding and knowledge of the words of the Bible than we today might imagine to be possible. The monks, with most historical Christians, were convinced that the new covenant in Jesus Christ was the lens through which the first covenant with Israel had to be read or reread. After all, Jesus himself and the authors of the New Testament indicate as much, that the law and the prophets testified to what had come in Jesus. Now, this goes beyond the ordinary expectations of prophecy. It also goes beyond simply reading the Old Testament texts in a merely allegorical way, as often older texts are read allegorically to make them relevant to life for some general reason. The conviction of the monks, after that of the apostles, was that the divinely intended meaning of the Old Testament texts could only be fully understood when reread in the context of the new covenant and the context of what had come about through Christ. And that there were, in fact, inspired layers of meaning that could not even have been, at least normally or observably, known by the people who wrote them down themselves. And therefore, there is a power to a secondary rereading of the Old Testament text and discovering things in them that the Holy Spirit inspired unexpectedly or by surprise that we can only see now in retrospect. This is an approach to what is called the mystical meaning of the text, or the spiritual meanings of the text. And it's one that thrived on a certain cleverness and creativity. The general approach, certainly to certain prophecies, was to understand certain obvious, clear prophecies that Jesus would have pointed to as things that the followers should have known that he would have fulfilled immediately. Those have more of a simple and direct meaning, perhaps. But many, many other texts of the Old Testament were understood to have these hidden meanings, which could be numerous and were not to be, simply resolved on a one-to-one level. So the interesting result of the monastic orientation towards Christ is that the often less familiar and more puzzling texts of the Old Testament came to the foreground in monastic preaching and monastic writing for a fresher and deeper understanding of the New Testament. So what they are really and clearly talking about in the process of doing that is life in Christ and the Christian era. And they're experimenting with possible ways that God already in the Old Testament gave ways of understanding this. So that's to speak generally of the classical form of exegesis, the medieval form of exegesis. One special strain in connection with the link between the Old and New Testaments is the question of Christ as the bridegroom. And in order to illuminate that a little bit, I've made a chart of some New Testament texts to flesh this out. So let me bring that up. So here you can see divided up into different portions in the New Testament. So the synoptic tradition of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Pauline letters, and the Johannine tradition, that is John's Gospel and the book of Revelation, different ways that Jesus emerges as presented within the text itself as mystically involved in some kind of a marriage that has to do with the meaning of creation. And I don't need to piece these out individually, but I want you to be able to glance at them, at least have a sense of both the variety and the consistency of this theme in the New Testament, that it comes across in quite different authors in quite different ways. And this gives us kind of two valuable results. One is that when we see kind of the mystery and the many different ways that this appears in later Christian exegesis, we see that this is actually rooted in the kind of the shimmering nature of this concept in the New Testament, that Christ is frequently spoken of as bridegroom, and the way that his counterpart is described as roughly the Christian community or the individual Christian comes across with great fruitfulness, with great interest, but also without being able to be easily pinned down. The second kind of piece of interest why I want to present this to you tonight is actually for the non-believers in the audience as a matter of historical interest, because this historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth is of such curiosity. And even for one who does not take the Bible or take the New Testament as something that is reliable at face value, when you look across the different sections of the New Testament and see this kind of consensus in diversity, one of the things that historians think that indicates, even apart from convictions of faith, is that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, actually said that he is the bridegroom, actually presented himself in this way, actually spoke these parables, that, whether or not they believe the individual words of the particular biblical text, the strong sense is that he was saying something astounding about himself, which invites interesting reflection in its own right. Let me take that slide down for the time being. With that, we can move on into the question of the Cistercian movement and the Song of Songs as it comes to monastic prominence in the 12th century. So in the Latin West, monastic interest in the Song of Songs was present before then in very significant ways, but it was still relatively less and relatively limited. But there's a major burst of interest in the Song of Songs that does occur in the 12th century. And the key driving force for this is the rise of the Cistercian movement, the Cistercian monastic reform. I'd like to also take a moment to accent, however, an intertwined driving force with that's worth reflecting on. This whole era of the 12th century was marked by an extraordinary cultural exuberance. It's often spoken of as the 12th century Renaissance in Europe. It was a key historical moment of change. The population, by sheer numbers, was exploding. This was correlated with rebirth and tumult in the arts and in politics and in intellectual life. On the physical level, some of the key remnants that this leaves on the face of the earth is the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages, which were undertaken in the 12th century in particular. Along with this great cultural vibrancy, there's also the emergence of an incredibly powerful concept of love and romance. So in time and in geography, interestingly, the origins of the Cistercian movement were incredibly closely connected with the troubadours, with courtly love, with the rise of chivalry, and the ideal of the quest for romance and the quest for service, a noble service of one's Lord. And when you think about how the Song of Songs might tie into that, it probably becomes fairly clear and significant. We have an explosive new monastic movement reorganizing things to the glory of God. These people have a strong theological orientation towards thinking about history as the story of a marriage, as we saw on the basis of the New Testament. They have a strong cultural new interest in romance, in feelings and the heart and union and drama. And so this discovery, or this deeper discovery of a biblical book that is about romance and the wooing of the heart and the longing for one who is absent, is a natural connection. Now, the key person for this movement is Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. And so let me bring up another image here. Here we have a painting of Bernard in the chapter house, so in a monastery, teaching his monks. He was incredibly dynamic and the force who was driving this expansion of monastic renewal, along with, in general, the renewal of culture throughout Europe. And this doctrine on his interest in the Song of Songs is one that was shared with his followers. And so I also want to take the opportunity, while I have the slides up, to feature for you also by dates the people that we'll be hearing from tonight. So Bernard is a key author. He's not the only author of the movement by far. Tonight we'll hear from 3 others as well. We'll also hear from Blessed William of St. Thierry, who was a Benedictine abbot and a close friend of St. Bernard and eventually became a Cistercian himself. Blessed Gueric of Igny, who was previously a professor of theology before becoming a monk under St. Bernard, learning his doctrine and then being sent out to be an abbot in his own right at the monastery of Igny. And then later into the 13th century, we'll look at the teaching of Beatrice of Nazareth. Incidentally, it's worth noticing that with Blessed Beatrice, Nazareth is not the Nazareth in the Holy Land, but Nazareth is the name of the monastery, which was in Brabant. She spoke Flemish. Now, Bernard, as this key figure, in his focus on preaching about the Song of Songs, there's an interesting puzzle to this, in that the way the timing works, it's unclear how much the popularity of his preaching on the Song of Songs and his teaching on the Song of Songs was leading the wave, was generating the wave of interest in romance, and how much it was riding that wave. But in any case, there was a strong dialogue that we see between Bernard and his audience with a strong thirst for interest in this topic. And this is evident then as it kind of has its, not its final outcome, but a major landmark in the following century with Dante. Dante's union of human love, secular love, with sacred love, with the Creator God, and Dante placing Bernard as his key guide into paradise. This is not an accident or insignificant in any way. Now, with all that being said about the connection between this idea of Bernard being in love with love and Bernard's followers being in love with the idea of love, and the focus, the extraordinary focus that they did give in their teaching to the Song of Songs, it's worth making a couple of caveats. So Bernard plays this note of the Song of Songs in his preaching and of romance often, but with extreme care and discretion and skill. So to say that the early Cistercians were only interested in the Song of Songs when it came to the Bible would be a great mistake, right? We're focusing on that for now because of its distinctiveness, but not because it overwhelms other things. For these authors, love stands on the basis always of faith and hope, of solid Christian doctrine, and they were always Christians first as they were questing for Christ. The first sermon on the Song of Songs indicates that Bernard assumes that his audience is already fully mature in faith and discipline. He's not speaking to the newest recruits fresh from the village dances or from courtly contexts. It's also a good illustration to this to note, if one looks in the indices in the back of these texts, as far as biblical citations, the Song of Songs is not the most frequently referred to book. That is far and away actually the book of Psalms. That's followed then by the Gospels, by the book of Genesis, by Isaiah. Then we have the Song of Songs. So with that, we can shift to beginning to talk more about texts and seeing how some of this works out in their imagination. And William of St. Thierry is the key, or is probably the most systematic thinker of the group. And so we'll give him the first word to help us get a sense of how it fits together. And what we're especially interested in now is the Song of Songs itself as a drama, as a quest, as a whole book. Oops. So this is from William's commentary on the Song of Songs. And he's going to speak, first of all, and we're going to look at here at the initial level of the Song of Songs, what he calls the historical level, the literal level, it could be called, what it appears to be on the surface. And he's going to read into it more deeply than a lot of people will be, to see it as a continuous narrative, as a kind of a cantata, rather than as simply not particularly orderly set of love songs. But he sees it as revealing a particular drama. So he says, now the argument of the historical drama, tale or parable proposed in the Song of Songs, may be stated as follows. King Solomon took to wife the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. So he's reading into some of the figures here. Not everyone's going to read it quite this way, but he points out the significance of this idea. At first, Solomon granted her certain favors of the bridal bed and of love and of the kiss. Then, after having shown her part of his riches and part of his glory, he cast her forth from their mutual union and the favor of the kiss, until by riddance of her Egyptian darkness and rejection of the customs of a barbarous nation, she might become worthy of access to the royal bride chamber. So this is how William puts together this drama of intimacy, especially intimacy remembered and longed for in the future. We'll come back to this in a moment, but I want to now pivot to this specific idea of the kiss, which is one of the most beloved images in the Cistercian literature on the topic, that will help us to really see how these fundamental ideas are approached. And for this, we'll look at a text from St. Bernard's second sermon on the Song of Songs. In that context, he is commenting on the very first the very first verse of the Song of Songs, which is, "Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth." And Bernard takes this as a prayer, as a longing for direct contact with God. And he specifically, as he leads into the passage that we'll see, he notes how I don't want simply the kiss of the prophets, of those who spoke of him. I want to contact with the mouth of God himself. And this is how he frames it. He says, his living and effective word is to me a kiss, which is not indeed an adhering of the lips that can sometimes belie a union of hearts. And I have to pause here and notice the power of that specific idea and its connection to his way of seeing the relation between earthly loves and spiritual loves, that he is longing for everything that physical love might gesture towards, but is not the same as, could be lying. I'm not looking for that, but an unreserved infusion of joys, a revealing of mysteries, a marvelous and indistinguishable mingling of the divine light with the enlightened mind, which, joined in truth to God, is one spirit with him. So here he is longing for the experience of heaven that he has, in some remote sense at least, already been granted, and is pining after the renewal of. With that in our quiver, we can then look back to how William layers on the spiritual meaning, or finds the mystical meaning hidden under this passage that we just saw, where he talks about the historical drama. So the next paragraph, William goes on to say, that's the historical meaning, but the spiritual sense of the text is this. When the soul has been converted to God and is to be espoused to the word of God, to heaven, at first she is taught to understand the riches of prevenient grace and allowed to taste and see how sweet the Lord is. She's given an experience of God's love coming before her and the joy of what it would mean to be in peace with God. But after that initial stage of spiritual life, of consolation, she is sent back into the house of her conscience, where she can be instructed, purified in the obedience of charity, perfectly cleansed of vices, and richly adorned with virtues, that she may be found worthy of access to the spiritual grace of godliness and affection for virtues, which is the bride chamber of the bridegroom, which is ultimately heaven itself. So here we see how profoundly spiritual is the orientation of their interest in the Song of Songs, that the process of the absence of the lover, and in this beautiful illustration, we have the bride standing alone. In her longing for him, she is undergoing the journey of the life of conversion, the life of conformity to Christ. Here, hopefully, you can see how the texture of that idea of life as a romance, of life as an inner quest for Christ, for the love of God, is extremely strong. To fast forward a little bit to Beatrice of Nazareth in the 13th century, we can see this being developed even more specifically. So Beatrice, interestingly, is the author of one of the very first vernacular spiritual treatises in the vernacular language in Europe. And in that praise of love that she gives, the 7 ways of love, that sense of devotion to love itself, of being in love with being in love, in a way that is ultimately spiritually oriented, ultimately Christocentric, is especially visible in that she uses the word love more often than she uses the words God or Christ. The power of love itself is when she's speaking of God, and it has all of this Christian content within it, but has this almost courtly flavor of some have called a courtly mysticism there. So here she says that there is a desire that comes forth from love with great energy, and this must reign in the heart for a long time before it has the power completely to drive out all of its adversaries. Hopefully you see this knightly language of longing and of conquest. This must work as tasked with strength and skill and find its fulfillment in so doing. It's a noble task. It is the process of learning chaste and generous love that is a love of true service and devotion that deserves the fullness of the reward of the beloved. With that assessed of the overall arc of what's going on in the Cistercian reading of the Song of Songs, I'd like to see or to show how this comes together in some commentaries on specific verses. So the Cistercians become very, very gifted at continuing a tradition that within commentary on the Song of Songs in the Latin West was already extant, but of making more personal and more vivid also how specific verses unfold this drama, this Christian drama of salvation. And so to look at one case, we'll see how Blessed Gueric of Igny, in a sermon of his on the feast of St. John the Baptist, uses this verse, "I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me." And I'm using translations that come from the Vulgate, but this is often rendered as, "I belong to my beloved, and my beloved belongs to me," or we're oriented towards each other. It's this image of complementarity. Gueric is not preaching specifically on the Song of Songs. He's preaching on the Saints' Day, and this is what he says as at the beginning of his sermon. He says, "Jesus began to ask the crowds concerning John, 'What did you go out to see in the desert?'" He's citing the gospel text. And then he comments by immediately going to the Song of Songs. He says, "Behold what the bride boasts of concerning the bridegroom in a canticle of their love." She says, "I to my beloved, and my beloved to me," this expression of mutuality. And then Gueric pivots and says, "So John to Jesus, and Jesus to John." John was the forerunner. He proclaims Jesus in advance. Jesus commends John. He points him out to his followers in retrospect and thanksgiving. Like is returned for like, and an interchange that is as friendly as it is just. For Jesus says, "I love those who love me, and I will glorify those who glorify me. And interestingly, those two italicized quotes at the end that are put in the mouth of Jesus, those are actually both Old Testament quotes that Guerick feels perfectly comfortable saying that this is the God of the Old Testament speaking in the human person of Jesus Christ, or in the human nature of Jesus, the Word incarnate. To look at the way this goes with a different verse, so we have a little bit of the variety. Looking at Song of Songs 5:14, the text reads, "His body is of ivory studded with sapphires." And Guerick is going to use this now in a sermon on the Annunciation of the Archangel Gabriel to Mary. This is what he does with it. He says, he quotes the gospel text, "Blessed is the womb that bore you, Lord Jesus. Happy is the chastity of the virginal womb which provided the material for this work of art. Happy indeed, my brethren, is the brilliance of that ivory, that is, the whiteness of chastity, in preference to which our Solomon, that is Christ, chooses neither the gold of worldly wisdom, nor the silver of eloquence, nor again the gem of any outstanding grace, provided that chastity is commended by humility. For the Lord has looked upon the humility of his handmaid." This necessity of humility to accompany chastity is a major theme in monastic literature. "Therefore, when Solomon in his canticle of love proclaimed the virgin's chastity," that is, the chastity of both bride and bridegroom, since the same words of praise befit, for the most part, those who share the same spirit and the same flesh, that is to say, this verse that he's referring to seems to immediately speak of the ivory body adorned with sapphires of the bridegroom. The bride is the body of the head, and he feels free to transfer these. It says, in order to show that their chastity was adorned, and ours must be adorned with other virtues too, he said, his body is of ivory studded with sapphires. So here we have two examples of Guerick of Igny following in Bernard's wake, adorning his ideas with this note or with this spice of the Song of Songs, and of evoking the affectivity, of evoking the sense of devotion, that just saying there's a spiritual meaning in this text that unfolds this other thing that I want to talk about. It's also, of course, bewildering the level of freedom that the monks used in applying these things to these verses to context that didn't seem to connect to them in any kind of obvious way. So he's connecting a praise of the beautiful physique of the bridegroom from the Song of Songs to the chaste love between the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Christ child. Now, to get a fuller development of how all this works, I want to conclude or draw towards a conclusion by looking at how Bernard in particular, how the master develops at some greater length a different verse. This is Song of Songs 1:3, where it reads, "Draw me after you, and we will run in the fragrance of your ointments." Bernard comments on this in the 21st sermon on the Song of Songs. Now, it's worth noting that it takes him 21 sermons to get to verse 3 of the Song of Songs. So he's talking about this in great detail, and he's also talking about a lot of other things in the process. But he develops this with a great deal of focus. What I would point out in his development in Sermon 21 is a few distinctions that he makes. First, he focuses on being this language of being drawn after Christ. Draw me after you. He notes that suggests that Christ is in motion, that he is running somewhere, and the bride has to follow him, not just arrive to a specific destination, but be constantly in motion. This is something that reflects in St. Bernard's mind the enormity of Christ's virtue. So he says that Christ or excuse me, that the bridegroom wants the grace to follow after Christ's way of life, to emulate his virtue, to hold fast to a rule of life similar to his, and achieve some degree of his self-control. This finds its expression ultimately, of course, in the level of might and strength that it takes for him to arrive at the cross and to give his life in its fullness. But to me, the most interesting distinction that Bernard makes in this interpretation is he looks very closely at the text and he says, there are two different motions being talked about here after Christ. First, the bride says, draw me after you, drag me, even though I am struggling with my motion, even though I don't have the strength to get there or to do what you're doing. And then there's a second image of motion, and that is of running. And Bernard makes this distinction that there is a moment where one needs to be drawn because one is stuck and one is essentially by human nature not able to do what the incarnate word is able to do. But there's also the blessing of a moment when the fragrance of his ointments enables us to run after him. This he describes as the fact that the Spirit puts us in different spiritual situations on the journey to Christ that we're not in control of. Sometimes we need to be dragged, and sometimes we're given the strength of running. So he says, for example, therefore, when you feel weighed down by apathy, lukewarmness, and fatigue, do not yield to cowardice or cease to study spiritual truths, but look for the hand of one who can help you, begging like the bride to be drawn, until finally, under the influence of grace, you feel again the vigorous pulse of life. Then you will run and shout out, I run on the way of your commandments, since you have enlarged my heart. Now here, Bernard is developing two particular things with this concluding verse, which is taken from the Psalms, most obviously, I'll run in the way of your commandments since you have enlarged my heart. First, he is also beginning to evoke all of these New Testament images of people who run, which is something that happens surprisingly often in the New Testament and moments of spiritual fervor. So, for example, all the running that goes on around the tomb of Christ when there's a reported resurrection experience, or St. Paul speaking of the Christian life as running the race. But Bernard is then also, interestingly here, alluding to the prologue to the rule of St. Benedict, which does not, so St. Benedict does not refer to the Song of Songs to my knowledge, but there is a place where he says that this is all of this discipline that I'm setting up for you, the whole structure of this monastery is about putting you in a place where you will eventually be able to run with your heart expanded. And Bernard is brilliantly making this connection, saying this is also what lies within the Song of Songs. To draw this to a conclusion as we move towards question and answer, I want to share a bit of a longer quotation from some of the way that Bernard develops this with beautiful poetic insight as he speaks of the image of the warmth that comes when we are able to run, when the ointments become fragrant. You know, the perfume doesn't smell as strongly in a cold situation, but the warmth enables the vapors to come more fully. This is how he expresses it. He says, draw me after you. We shall run in the odor of your ointments. It is indeed necessary that we be drawn, because the fire of your love has quickly cooled within us. We cannot run now because of this cold, as we did in former days. But we shall run again when you restore to us the joy of knowing that you are our Savior, when the benign warmth of grace will have returned with the renewed shining of the sun of justice. The troubles that hide him from us like clouds will then pass. The soft breath of the caressing breeze will melt the ointments, and the perfumes will rise to fill the air with their sweet odor. Then we shall run with eagerness where the wafted perfumes draw us. The lethargy that now numbs us will vanish with the return of fervor, and we shall no longer need to be drawn. Stimulated by the perfumes, we shall run of our own accord. But for now, draw me after you. So having now seen a sense of how this inner quest for Christ, this journey of love of God is expressed, I think it's a good time for us to transition to more of a discussion.
Fantastic, Father Joseph. Thank you so much for your very fine talk. We have a number of questions. Again, I'll invite all of you to submit your questions via the Q&A function, which is on the bottom of your screen, the little two speech bubbles there together with Q&A. You can pop in your question. I would like to invite Mark Barrett, and if he's available to even ask his question live, we can promote him to be a panelist. And
Hi there. Yeah.
where are you coming from, Mark?
From Michigan.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you, Father, for sharing your both of you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. So
You're welcome.
yeah. So I've read a little bit of interpretation of Song of Songs from Saint Jerome and Gregory of Nyssa. I just wonder if there's any commentary, homilies on the Song of Songs from the 5th through 9th centuries before we get to William and Bernard.
There is some. So the strongest one that I know of is by Saint Bede the Venerable. And so Bede in the 9th century is going to really develop he will do a lot of the individual verses and looking for the symbolism within specific images, whether it's the myrrh or the lily or whatever. But he especially though remains really focused on these as images of the church, and does not go as much into the question of the soul and the journey of the soul, the drama of the soul, or seeing kind of the overall dramatic arc of the Song of Songs as a part of the topic. So it's especially in that period, ecclesiology in the Latin commentaries is the main event of Song of Songs use. There's also kind of around this time, just kind of before Bernard, as the interest in the Song of Songs is beginning to ramp up, there's a tendency to read the bride as an image for the Virgin Mary and look for kind of ways of connecting those dots. So Rupert of Deutz does that. Much earlier, there's Apollonius. There are a good handful, but certainly not with the level of vigor or personal orientation that you would see in Bernard and the other Cistercians.
Thank you very much for that. Speaking of, I would wonder if Dave and Charlotte Catlett would be available to ask their question that they posted. Dave and Charlotte, especially talking about the bride and the relationship to the church here.
Yeah, hi, this is Dave Catlett and Charlotte Catlett. We're in Allen, Texas.
Excellent.
And, actually, I'm an adjunct professor there at UD. So we got wind of the seminar through John Norris at UD. So our question was that it seemed that the soul, in one of those quotes, I think from William of Igny.
St. Thierry.
Okay, he talked about the soul as in feminine terms. She is this and she is that. Was that a consequence of the translation, or is that an intentional female personification?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the Latin is anima, which is a feminine word. And so that will be part of it. And also feminine pronouns are used when connecting back to her. But kind of more significantly and more substantially, that's a consequence of the fact that, the counterpart of the bridegroom is the bride. And so when reading this as the drama of the soul, it's necessarily presented as the bride. But there's also a lot of play that goes on with that, right? So most evidently from things that I presented tonight would be in that sermon on St. John the Baptist, where John the Baptist is spoken of as the beloved. And so, and of course, most, these texts that I've presented tonight are abbots principally preaching to monks, preaching to men about their souls, which have this feminine relationship to God in some sense.
Thank you very much. Kind of broadening the conversation a little bit to understand the sort of larger medieval culture and connection is a question that Caroline Maloney has. Caroline, if we could have her unmuted and if you're available to ask your question.
Yes, thank you so very much for this on the Song of Songs. Much more profound than the initial study that I did on Song of Songs. But my question to you, Father Joseph, is you made the connection between Dante, the Song of Songs, Dante, and Beatrice as being the same time period. I'm just wondering, because it's Beatrice the feminine who leads Dante to the Paradiso. I'm just wondering if there's any broad connection you can make there for me, please.
Sure. So, and specific, the connection that you're looking for is
just broadly.
Okay. So, Dante in Florence is obviously extremely well educated, and one thing that's kind of interesting is if you look for paintings of Saint Bernard, a lot come out of Florence. There is a strong devotion that is there, and Dante knew Bernard's text very well, and so that devotion to the bride that is obviously an analog of a quite human relationship to the meaning of life is what captures. It certainly obviously captures Bernard's attention, and within that, as Dante, as a devout man who is also drawing a lot from the tradition of courtly love and this, being in love with love, he's a layman in the more secular sense, drives that on. And so, yes, Beatrice's love is what draws him towards heaven, draws him through purgatory, but then, Bernard has to be in heaven his guide. And so Dante writes Bernard into the Paradiso at that point. It's also, to broaden that out just a little bit more, this tradition of commentary on the Song of Songs and the orientation to see the love that moves the stars as a marriage that describes the universe also then makes Bernard a key player in later traditions. So Arthurian romance, the quest for the Holy Grail, the Renaissance humanists, St. John of the Cross, and the Living Flame of Love and Spiritual Canticle. Also devotion to the Sacred Heart. Figures like Beatrice of Nazareth, especially so the Cistercian nuns of the 13th century, have both visions and extensive reflections written upon the heart of Christ as the love of their lives and as the source of all faith and spirituality. And so that Dantesque connection of loves is something that is a reflective of a huge Cistercian influence on the Romanticism of the West.
Yeah, thank you for that fine response. Just such a wide palette of connections. Maybe speaking, having spoken a little bit about sort of the divine erotic love and Peter Steiger has a question about spiritual friendship, and if he could be unmuted, he could ask his own question.
Hi, Father Joseph. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm listening here from Honolulu, Hawaii.
Awesome.
Can you make a connection to the notion of spiritual friendship in the Cistercian tradition, especially Saint Aelred? Thanks.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, there are so many authors of this movement that we could have quoted, and Aelred certainly would have been one of them. So I'm glad for the chance to loop him in. So Aelred of Rievaulx is another one of these friends of Bernard, who is also an abbot, and he kind of his niche within this movement is the idea of devoted friendship as an expression of an experience of divine love. Aelred himself, to my recollection, it would be great to look at his treatise on spiritual friendship and see how much the Song of Songs comes up. I don't recall that it's as key for him. Like Gwerg of Igny, the Song of Songs will come up a lot as a seasoning within preaching. But you're absolutely right that this connection of the human love between friends is part of how the divine love is experienced. And the Cistercian reflection that especially centers in Aelred's tradition is that within the context of the fraternal life of the monastery, and then amplified out within the church or within humanity in a lot of ways, that the joys that are experienced through authentic friendship, through intimacy with another soul, are, or at least can be, profoundly sanctifying if the friend is chosen well and if everyone is doing what they need to be doing. And this also then kind of unfolds, right, how profoundly, like this is certainly the literature of celibates, and it's oriented towards an eternity in which we will all be celibate, but it is also very much human and very much incarnate within the reality that we've experienced and driven by the fact that our devotion to one another and the way, the most positive things that we experience from one another draw us with desire towards God and our sources of blessing.
Thank you for that. Just like to combine two questions since they touch on the same topic. So forgive me, participants, both Ryan Weiland and Marilyn Busaid, wanted you to sort of elaborate on what the relationship might be to what you're talking about in Bernard and this Cistercian interpretation of the Song of Songs, and connections potentially with the purification of the bride and St. John of the Cross and the dark night of the soul, and any sort of convergences or distinctions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I'll dive into it a little bit. So as we saw with that quote from William of St. Thierry, the process of growth in the virtues of Christ and growth in communion with Christ, and like also these experiences of desolation where I have to be dragged along. He also refers incidentally in that context to the verse of the gospel that when I am lifted up from the earth, i.e. on the cross in particular, I will draw all men to myself. And so that experience of being drawn has this cruciform character to it. That does have, constantly the emphasis on discipline of the senses, right? So of course, the Cistercian monastic life, especially in that era, was marked by physical austerity, but more significantly, by he emphasizes, and they will emphasize, the discipline of fidelity and the discipline of going through, we saw in Sermon 21 on the Song of Songs, going through desolation. That said, my sense and understanding of John of the Cross in comparison with Bernard and William and the other Cistercian writers is that there is a much stronger orientation towards focusing on the details of the desolation within John of the Cross, and on, dwelling on guidance through that experience, whereas and systematizing it and creating kind of this really specific sense of a hierarchy of spiritual steps of growth. And Bernard and his friends will do that, but not so rigorously and not so ultra consistently. It's not that they have kind of a specific number of spiritual steps in their minds that, always when they preach across the years will come up in the same way. But, in this sermon, when I'm preaching on this verse, there are kind of, there's one has to go through the wine cellar in order to get to the bridal chamber. Or later there's another image about physical motion across the field, and mapping those onto each other in a systematic way is more difficult to do, and it seems to me actually probably the wrong way to read Bernard.
Very interesting. This is a question from Jorge Gonzalez, and more of a question of clarification that if I'll just ask myself. We want to elaborate, or Jorge is being unmuted. We can let him talk about that as well. Sorry.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Where are you coming from?
Yeah. So I live in.
You just got muted.
Where are you coming from?
The Irving, Texas.
Oh,
Yay.
great.
Yeah, I'm a recent graduate from the University of Dallas.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I was just asking what William of St. Thierry meant by prevenient grace in the context he mentioned it in on the exposition on the Song of Songs. What does he mean by prevenient grace?
Good question. I had thought about making a little aside on that, but in order to keep moving quickly, I didn't. But I'm glad to be turned back to it. So prevenient grace is this, especially Augustinian term, at least, referring to the fact that God loves us before we love God, and our ability to love comes as already a response to grace rather than just because we kind of as neutral or broken people are able to dig ourselves out of the hole that we're in. And when I'm teaching in high school, the way I like to compare, my metaphor for that is that we don't have God's phone number. God has to call us. And we can answer the phone and begin to have a conversation, which is, what might be classified as actual grace. So these distinctions, come about a little bit later. But the initiative comes from God's side. One of the also really neat things about having that piece of terminology there that enables me to highlight is like that's specific theological terminology, right? And even though in most of the quotes that I was giving, that kind of thing didn't come up a ton, it comes up with the kiss for sure. But when we classify the Cistercian writers as like spiritual writers or as simply as mystics, we miss easily the fact that even though they're not systematicians in a certain sense, we'll hear from Father John's talk in a couple of weeks about this distinction between monastic and scholastic, but they are profoundly theologically educated, and they are profoundly concerned with consistency and with the intellectual understructure of what they're talking about. And so William happening to drop in that passage, the very specific theological term helps to illustrate the huge brain power that's involved in this very holy man's talking about the spiritual journey.
I would ask Ann Platt if she could be unmuted. Maybe she could discuss.
Hi, Ann.
With you. Oh, you know
I
Ann?
know Ann.
Oh, great.
Hi, Father. I'm here from Frisco. Actually, my boyfriend Benjamin is the one who asked the question, so I'll let him ask it.
Yay.
Hi. Thank you, Father, for the great talk. So I was wondering if the increased interest in the Cistercian tradition of the Song of Songs is a departure from the hesitancy one might gather in the early Middle Ages as an Augustine towards conjugal love. So some writers argue, whether falsely or accurately, that Augustine was hesitant towards conjugal love and the goodness of it. So do you see the Cistercian tradition being similarly careful about this matter, or do you think they are their interest in the Song of Songs is a departure from this?
That's a great question. Thank you for it. So the early Cistercians were definitely what we would categorize as Augustinians. They were profoundly influenced by Augustine in hugely numerous ways, which is part of why, in response to the previous question, I had to mention Augustine. And different authors and the same authors at different times will give us different nuances. In general, like at this first layer, we'll see some hesitancy there, but I would say it seems to me not as accentuated as in Augustine for sure. For someone who really wants to dig in deep on that, a book that I know of but obviously haven't read is by Jean Leclerc called Monks on Marriage, which will give you a ton of details on this. But you're right that, like, even though kind of in the moral theology, as they're kind of dealing with this Platonic sense of, the deep fragility of the body, and the Augustinian concern with human brokenness on the moral level, they hesitate. But this orientation towards devotion, towards human love, does pull them in a different trajectory. And then you'll especially have just in the next, actually beginning in that generation with a figure like Peter Abelard, who wants to argue a very specific kind of moral analysis about, like, what is the role of the body? What is the role of moral intention and these kinds of things, that allows more space for seeing something that was previously seen as, like, in the context of marriage, sex is seen as kind of excusable, to being seen as a neutral thing that can be oriented towards something that's really, really positive and good. And so in the author that I studied for my dissertation, Geoffrey of Auxerre, who was Bernard's closest student in a lot of ways, is his kind of personal protege for 8 years. And Geoffrey writes a great deal on his own later. And in Geoffrey, I don't see the same kind of platonically oriented hesitation about matters of the body, in particular about marital sexuality, that one would see in earlier authors. So this does seem to be a moment of emerging transition.
And I'd like to ask to Sarah Maple if she could be unmuted, and she has a rather urgent question that I think is quite salient and contemporary.
Hello, thank you very much. Good evening, Father Joseph. This is actually a question from my husband.
Okay.
Thank you, Father Joseph, for your wonderful insights and research. It's good to see you, and it's good to hear you. So I guess it seems like the Song of Songs is very important to the foundation and the renewal that a lot of these early Cistercians were doing towards building what the Cistercian life was supposed to be. So I guess my question is, how are you all living that life today? How are you continuing to sort of enrich, aside from giving wonderful talks like these, of course, but like in your own liturgical life and prayer life, in what way is the Song of Songs continuing to enrich your life as a Cistercian today?
That's a great and thoughtful question. It's interesting that one of the funny things about beginning our series on this topic is that when I was a novice, one of the things that we were kind of suggested was, like, focusing too much on the Song of Songs is something that you're probably not ready for yet. Let's save that for later, for when you're kind of more advanced and mature. And that's something that as I mentioned in the talk, this kind of, as you tally up quotations, seeing that the Song of Songs does not, is a flavor rather than something that overwhelms, is significant. So the center of it remains Christianity as it has always been, and the life of faith and prayer and service. And then we realize that we are affective beings, and in our quest for long-term wholeness and for replacing and surpassing the human loves that we've renounced, we're constantly orienting in this way, which I would say most especially is Eucharistic, and one of the part of the shimmery nature of this realm of discourse, where you think you're looking at one thing, you think you got the image of the bride nailed down, and then it becomes kind of something else. Obviously, that is connected to the fact that Christ himself was celibate, and union with him is not sexual, but Eucharistically we have what that communion aims for, and then so just in chapter last night, as we were leading into Compline, the reading was on how the Psalms should be prayed. And the idea that St. Benedict presents is that the Psalms need to be prayed in a spirit with a sincere heart, with reverence and understanding of who you're dealing with. And this calls us to mindfulness about who we're in relationship with. And then I would also say that the question earlier about spiritual friendship and profound and authentic human fellowship is something that I'm so grateful that our monastery is really very blessed with. That there is on a secular level often, and also on the most profound levels, human communion between the monks that I've been blessed by so many times. And so the fraternal interactions there also nourish a sense of loyalty to being a friend of Christ, or to being a friend of the bridegroom, and what that means, and express sacramentally or representationally the fact that that I'm not alone in the world, or that I'm not alone in my vocation and my mission, but that this is shared with the community. And maybe as a last aspect of that to draw out, the Song of Songs has actually more than two speakers in the biblical book. There are friends of the bride and bridegroom who are mentioned in the passage from chapter 1:3 that I concluded with. There is this "we will run after you" that emerges after the "draw me." And the sense, and I think especially within men's spirituality, this is very significant. The sense is not always that one plays the role of bride or bridegroom personally. Bernard also often writes about basically being a spectator, or being a friend of the bridegroom, as being a servant of that love and that mystery that is at the heart of being. And so then this emerges within our teaching, within the other things that we mentioned, the fraternal life, the liturgical life, as our chance to just have, to touch the hem of the bridal gown, as it were, to assist chastely, nobly, within the love that Christ has for the church, that Christ has for the souls of others that we minister to also as priests.
Well, thank you very much. So real titillating discussion that spans the beginning of the medieval period, 10th, 11th century to 21st century Irving, Texas. We crossed a wide gap. So we are certainly grateful for your talk this evening, Father Joseph, and all your wisdom that was drawn out in this question and answer session. We thank all of our participants for your kindness and attention, and very engaging questions throughout this question and answer session. We certainly want to thank our co-presenters and our friends at St. Our Lady of Dallas Cistercian Abbey. Our next installment of this webinar series will be July 25th. Again, they're all on Sundays at 7:30 p.m. Central Time. That will be featuring Father Abbot Peter Verhalen, who will speak to us. The title is A School for the Lord's Service, a meditation on the rule of Saint Benedict. We also want to thank our co-sponsors in this series, the Harvard Catholic Forum, the Nova Forum, the St. Benedict Institute, and Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture at the University of Dallas. So thank you again for your participation tonight. Please consider supporting our mission by tuning in to these future events, staying in touch for all sorts of both in-person and hybrid events that will be rolling out in the fall, and also considering donating at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. Have a fine evening and God bless all of you.